lead meeting.
My video on. Okay. Okay, hello everyone in the room and online. So today we have Carson Miller discussing her work on paleo-barrier islands. So Carson is a third-year PhD candidate at UTIG in the Jackson School, working with Sean Gulick and John Goff. Carson got her undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill and then stayed on to get a master's in geology, and then stayed on to get a master's degree in marine science.
Yep.
Yep. And then and then came here to UTIG. So yeah, so without further ado, take her away. And, yeah.
Thanks, Ed. So this is stuff that I started working on this summer. And so I kind of want to preface this and just say I'm still very much in the interpretation phase of this. And so I have a lot of maps to show and some conclusions, but not a ton yet. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so a little bit about the motivation behind this work. So the Texas coast has a pretty large coastal population. I gotta move your faces out of the way so I can see things. So about a quarter of the Texas population lives in the coastal region, and this is pretty accurate for the rest of the country as well. So I really like this first panel because it really shows, I think, quite well this large population center of Houston that's right in the coastal region. And so also within the coastal region, we have a lot of hazards like sea level rise and storms. And so about 80% of the Texas coast is considered critically eroded. That's what this bottom panel is showing right here. So these are erosion rates. And you'll notice both on the Gulf side and within the Bay, we have fairly high erosion rates, sometimes greater than 14 feet a year. And I know that's like a terrible metric using feet, but GLO loves that. And so when you have these really high coastal populations and you couple that with these really high erosion rates, your coastal populations become increasingly vulnerable to climate change, specifically sea level rise and storms. And so both GLO and BOEM, so GLO is General Land Office of Texas, BOEM is Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, are very interested in understanding where some of our sand resources are off of the Texas coast. And that is because they put together this huge multi-system approach to trying to protect the coast to sea level rise and storms. And so this is an example, just in Galveston Bay, they're planning on doing all of these different projects like the Bolivar Gate system, which will be open most of the year, but as storms roll in, they will close them and it'll protect against storm surge. And there's a lot of different things that they're planning. This is also with the Army Corps of Engineers, but they've also contracted out other people like us to look for sand resources. And that's because these two projects, so on the Bay side, we have ecosystem restoration, and then on the Gulf side, dune and beach restoration. These two projects require a lot of sand. And so specifically on the Gulf side, they're planning on doing dune restoration. So not only are they planning to add sand to the existing dunes, but they also want to create a dune in front of that dune. So it'll be a multi-dune system that can kind of protect against storm surge. They also want to do some beach restoration. So not just create the dune, but then actually widen the beach. So just pile sand on the beach, create a wider beachfront. And then also they're interested in doing some island restoration. So there's these different small islands that can kind of act as breakwater and break those, some of that wave energy as it travels on shore. And so adding more sand to these islands. And so that's kind of where we come in. So we are starting to look for sand resources off the Texas coast. And we typically find different sediments deposited in these incised valley systems. And so during the last glacial maximum, rivers were able to incise into the continental shelf because sea level was much lower. And then around 17,000 years ago, sea level started rising again and then infilled those different incised rivers and deposited different kinds of coastal environments like rivers, estuaries, everything like that. So that's where we really find most of our sediment off the coast. And so this is kind of the framework that we operate in terms of where would sand actually be located within these incised valley systems. And so this is a typical estuarine barrier island system. On the seaward side of this, we have our barrier islands that are typically really good sand resources. However, they're not usually preserved in the geologic record. However, processes like overwash, so when you get a big storm, you can kind of spread your dune sands across the island, and those can actually get preserved in the geologic record. Another environment that typically gets preserved are tidal inlets and their associated flood and ebb tide deltas. So there's a lot of exchange between the estuary and the sea. You get a lot of sediment transport. And because it's really high energy, you typically get sands deposited in those environments as well. Another good sand resource. Moving back into the Central Bay, you have a more quiescent, low energy environment. So you're not really going to get those sands anymore, and you're going to mostly get muds just draping over the existing topography. Closer to your fluvial system, so you're going to have your fluvial deposits themselves, which are going to be very good sand resources. Again, more energy in that environment, so point bars can get deposited. Those would be really good sand resources. And then your Bayhead Delta can be a good sand resource. However, if you're closer to your Central Bay, you'll probably have a lot of muds mixed in your sands, whereas if you're closer to your fluvial system, you'll get more sands in your Bayhead Delta. So can be a good sand resource just depending on where you are. And so another thing with these are, they want to look for economically viable sand. And so that's going to be sands that are closer to the surface. So if they're too far down, it's going to cost a lot of money to extract them, and it's not going to be worth it. And so they're really looking at some of these more seaward portions of our estuarine system that are good sand resources. So this is my study area. These are all my chapters that they're not really in the right order anymore. So this is probably going to be really chapter 1 now, but that's besides the point. So this is showing the Paleo-Sabine river valley that incised during that last glacial maximum. And then this is showing our different sand banks that are located kind of on top of that system. And so this is Sabine over to the east, and then farther to the west, we have Heald, and then a little bit of Shepherd Bank that we're seeing right here. And so all of this data was collected by Aptum, which is a contracting company that they got contracted to actually map the entire Texas shelf, which is pretty interesting within state waters, to really look at sand resources. And so BOEM contracted them to do a survey offshore. And so this is really just a recon survey. So line spacing, I think, is about 1 nautical mile apart. All right, so that leads me to the questions that I'm really interested in understanding. The first is, how do we identify a paleo-barrier island in the record? And then followed by, why do barrier islands drown if we do find them in the record? And then what conditions are conducive for preservation? And kind of on the flip side of that question is, if they're not barrier islands, what processes are controlling the formation of these marine sands, and why are they preserved where they are? So before we kind of jump into all of my results, I want to first talk about how we acquire all of our data and kind of give you some idea of what I'll be looking at. So we use a chirp system. So this is our large chirp system, and this is our baby chirp system. They operate at different frequencies, but very similar frequencies. And so we can get really good imaging with both systems. And when we first get the data, it looks like this. just we're out in the waves, so you get a lot of up and down from those waves. And so you can do a lot of processing, like heat filtering, tide corrections, tow pitch, depth corrections, so on and so forth, and get these really beautiful images of the stratigraphy beneath the seafloor. And so we have these two different types of data, envelope and full waveform, and they're very good at looking at different things. And so envelope is very good at looking at big picture regional scale deposition, whereas full waveform is not so good at that and really good at looking at internal stratigraphy. And so these are just examples of what they look like kind of at different scales. And so you can kind of see with the full waveform at this 1500 meter scale, everything kind of looks really fuzzy. It's kind of jumbled. Of course, you can still see stuff, but the envelope is really kind of showing you those big picture regional packages that we're seeing in the subsurface. And so then if you zoom into this little area right here, so this is more at the 300 meter scale. Now the envelope is starting to look very fuzzy, but the full waveform is really showing really nicely that internal stratigraphy for this package. So again, envelope is really good for big picture, regional scale processes, and then full waveform is really good at looking at that internal stratigraphy that might start telling us about more local processes. Oh, it might be frozen. Okay, there we go. I think that was it. Yep. Okay, perfect. All right, so once we have our data, then we use different methods to interpret it. And so this is from Jake Burstein's work. That's a little bit closer inland than my work is. And so what he did was he was able to find these different seismic facies. So just to show you a couple examples, we have some really high amplitude facies with some chaotic reflections. Kind of in this seismic facies 3, we have really low amplitude subparallel reflections. And then seismic facies 5 is showing these high amplitude unidirectional dipping reflections. And so when we kind of use that to determine what is happening in our subsurface, we can bound those different seismic facies by horizons. And then ultimately we can subtract those two horizons and get units, and then kind of put our interpretation on those units. So Bayhead Delta or estuary, something like that. And so that's how we're doing it. And so first I want to address this question of how do we identify a paleo-barrier island in the record? And so to do that, you can use both cores. You can also use seismic imaging. And so this is from, again, Jake's stuff, but also Patty Standring. So their stuff is also within the Gulf of Mexico, really close to my sites. So this is a really good example of what things might look like in my area. And so you can use tidal inlets, washover deposits, and transgressive ravine surfaces that will show you where a barrier island is. And so in terms of tidal inlets, you can see it really well in Jake's work. So this orange horizon is bounding the bottom of that erosional surface that the tidal inlet created. And so once you have that, you know that your barrier island is going to be kind of directly adjacent to that tidal inlet. So with washover deposits, Jake was actually able to map those in the subsurface, but Patty could also see them in her core data. So she found, this nice sand with a couple of shells layers within it that was indicative of washover deposits. And so with washover deposits, because it is washing over the island, you know that your barrier island is going to be in front of those washover deposits. And then finally, with your transgressive ravine surface, again, you can see this in seismics. It's a very pretty much planar erosional horizon. And then within the core, it's this lag deposit that's usually pretty shelly. And so with your transgressive ravine surface, that's the wave erosion that's actually pushing your barrier back. So if you have that ravine surface, you know that your barrier island went over that area at some point. Okay, so now that we know how to find it with both cores and seismics, different researchers have had different interpretations of healed and Sabine banks through time. So in 1994, Thomas and Anderson interpreted these marine banks, both healed and Sabine, as just marine sand bodies, and this was based on the absence of barrier island facies. So they used seismics, but I will say that it was not CHIRP, it was lower resolution seismic data. So they didn't see any of these different barrier island facies that we might see with higher resolution stuff. In 1999, Rodriguez et al. Ended up reclassifying both banks as paleo-barrier islands. And while they did have some seismic imaging at this time, they really relied on cores to say that they are both paleo-barrier islands. And they actually found some paleo marshes that they used as their classification for a barrier island. However, I have really high resolution data, so that's really great in order to see different things like washover deposits. So right here, I'm showing you an envelope image of Sabine Bank. So up here in my little map, we're on this line right here, cutting across Sabine Bank. And so we have our base of our valley. And then on top of that, we have our H1, which is going to be our base of our healed bank. H2 is the base of our Sabine bank sands. And then finally, we have the seafloor. And so one thing you might notice within this Sabine bank section are these really high amplitude dipping reflections, and they're actually dipping landward. And then if we take this and then we compare it to an image of healed bank, so again, Sabine is right here, we're looking at this, and then healed is down here. We're looking at this image for healed. Healed looks very different. So this blue, again, is our base of our healed bank sands. And we really see this homogeneous just sand sheet that has potentially one internal reflection really close to the top. And so this indicates to us that Sabine is very likely a paleo-barrier island, but that healed bank isn't. So one thing I do want to point out about healed bank really quickly, and I'll show this a little more in detail in a minute, is the base of that healed bank sand is composed of both an erosional horizon and a conformable horizon. And so currently we have it mapped as just one horizon, but the difference between conformable and erosion is likely telling us something about process and environment. And I'll show the distribution of that in a minute. But for now, Sabine is a barrier island, healed is not. Okay, so now we have a barrier island, yay. We can try to answer this question of why do they drown? So there's several processes that are important in terms of barrier island drowning. I'm really gonna only go over a few of them, just because there are so many and there's variations within all of these different processes. So the first is sediment supply. So if you have really high sediment supply, you're going to increase your preservation, but you're also not going to have your barrier drown because it's not going to be starved of sediment. So within Galveston, we have a longshore drift transport direction that is away from Galveston and then combines down here just south of Corpus Christi. So we're going to have our highest sediment supply down here, going to correlate with higher preservation. Up near our study site, we're going to have lower preservation because we don't have as much sediment. In terms of antecedent topography, this is a modeling study done by Justin Schaller. And so he has a lot of different cases showing different slopes and how your barrier island might either survive or drown. I'm just going to show two. So if you have either a really low slope or a negative slope, so a slope that goes from 0.4 to negative 0.4, your barrier island's ultimately going to drown. And that's because you're increasing your accommodation space behind your barrier island, and you're going to need more sediment to fill that space in order for it to survive. But if you're holding your sediment supply constant, you can't fill that space, it's ultimately going to drown. If you look at a increasing slope or a positive change in slope, your barrier island's going to be able to survive, and that's because you're decreasing your accommodation space, not changing sediment supply, able to keep up, and therefore it survives. And so actually out of 3 of the 4 cases that he models, they drown, barrier islands drown. So sad future. Okay, so a couple other processes that are really important in terms of drowning and preservation is sea level rise and storms. So this is an example off of my favorite place in North Carolina of washover deposits. And so you can kind of see back in 2010, they had these very tiny washover deposits that formed, kind of cutting across the barrier island. But then after a hurricane, they grew pretty significantly. And then this one right here that's post Sandy actually cuts all the way across the island. I don't know if you can tell, but it's cutting across all this salt marsh. And so if you have a storm that does this and you can't rebuild your dunes to protect against the ocean, increases in sea level rise are just going to keep reactivating that washover fan. You're going to lower the elevation of your island and ultimately it can drown. All right, so trying to answer of why did Sabine drown? So Rodriguez et al. In 2004 suggest that Sabine drowns around 4.7 thousand years ago. And they say it's either because of decreases in sediment supply or you're crossing some kind of sea level threshold. They do kind of point out with this sea level threshold case that sea level is really low. So over here you can see it's only 1 millimeter a year when Sabine drowns. And so they say it's likely not the case to be sea level. However, because we had a high sea level before that, if we degraded our barrier island, it doesn't really matter what's happening with sea level. We've crossed some threshold where it just can't survive anymore. But the initial thought is that fluvial sands stabilize the barrier island. But once you deplete all of these sands, or you cross that sea level threshold, the barrier can't maintain its seaward position and it either moves back or drowns. And so they also say that around 5.3 thousand years ago to 2.5 thousand years ago, Galveston Island was a storm breach barrier. And so kind of in the same time Sabine drowns, and then post that we have a lot of storms in the region. So this is kind of what I've put together in terms of what's happening within the Gulf of Mexico during the Holocene. So this is where Sabine would drown. We have our climate right up here. And so during this time period, we have a really warm, dry climate, which means we're not going to have as much fluvial input into our system and therefore not as much sediment. And so we're decreasing our sediment just by having a warm, dry climate. Our sea level really low, only 1 millimeter per year. But then we also looked at the Mississippi Delta lobe shifting in terms of what is happening with sediment supply. And so all of these positions are relative to the position of this lobe. And so it starts out kind of in the western portion of the state. And then through time, it shifts east again, comes back to the west, right, east, west. So that's kind of how it's shifting through time. And during the time that Sabine drowns, it's shifting east. So it's shifting away from Galveston, which might influence our sediment supply. And then finally, with our storm record, we really don't have a great storm record around the time that Sabine drowns. But within this 2004 paper, they do mention that Galveston is a storm breach barrier at that time. So storms are likely important. Okay, so with all of that together, we have low sediment supply, we have low sea level rise, and we likely have a lot of storms. And so that suggests that this was just a perfect storm of Sabine drowning. So what we know so far is that we have identified Sabine as a paleo-barrier. Heald is not. Sabine likely drowned due to sediment supply reduction and antecedent topography. Rodriguez et al. 2004 concurs with both of those. So we have that warm, dry climate. We have the Mississippi shift with the delta lobes. Our banks are located over our paleo valley, which would be a negative slope into the valley. And so we're thinking those are kind of all of the reasons that Sabine is drowning. and potentially buried. So now I want to go into this question of what conditions are conducive for preservation of sands. And I'm not going to answer this question today because I have not gotten there yet. But I do have a lot of data to show and kind of some ideas of what might be happening in the system. And so my major focus is really going to be on accommodation and antecedent topography because the valley is there and it has so much accommodation space. All right, so just to start off, this is a structure map of the valley bottom. So the sandbanks are located above this valley. And so the main trunk of the valley kind of comes through, unfortunately cuts off the data here. And you can start to see some of these little tributary systems coming from Lake Calcasieu. This is going up into the main Trinity River Valley. We have some more tributary systems. So I really love this map. I think it's really awesome to see the Paleo River Valley. All right, so also I want to point out that blues are deep and reds are highs. And I really screwed somebody up the other day because I think it flips when I do the difference maps. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at them. Okay. So moving on, I'm going to keep the Paleo Valley on here kind of while showing all of these maps just to orient you to where all of these things are located. So this is the distribution of Sabine and healed sand sheets. So this would be that base of the Sabine and healed, and then everything above. Oh no, I didn't. I flipped it back. Good. Okay, so red is still shallow and blue is still deep. Perfect. Okay, so what I think is really interesting about all of these maps that I'm about to show you is that these sand sheets are located within the valley, but they're also located outside of the valley. And so to me, that suggests that while accommodation is really important in terms of preservation, it's not the only factor that's important for preservation. So healed sands actually go underneath Sabine. So that's kind of giving us indication of time. And so healed's actually going to be a little bit older than Sabine. And then for Sabine, we have it distributed mostly to the north portion. All right, so moving on, I made these sand thickness maps and I'm going to remake these. We have a much more sophisticated gridding algorithm than Landmark has. And it can actually take into account two different horizons. So for example, you can subtract the base of healed from the seafloor over here, which is what this is showing you. And then when it dives under Sabine, you can subtract healed bank from Sabine, and that'll actually show you the real thickness of the sand sheet. Unfortunately, Landmark won't let me do that. And so these are a tiny bit misleading, but I'm just letting you know right now. So this is subtracting from the seafloor. So obviously we still have the influence of Sabine Bank. So this would be Sabine Bank combined with healed sands over here. So we really want to focus on this portion down here. And then this is the subtraction of the healed from the Sabine sand. So that's actually what it looks like up there. So again, we have a lot of the sands confined to the river valley. However, both Shepherd Bank and healed banks kind of up here are falling somewhat outside of our river valley. So again, that suggests that accommodation isn't the only important factor and something else has to be going on to get these sand sheets preserved. So this is Sabine. It's a really awesome sand sheet, and it's also mostly contained within the valley until you get kind of up here into the tributary system where it's no longer contained. All right, so I mentioned that Sabine Bank is a paleo-barrier island, and we kind of talked about these different reflectors. So they're dipping landward, which indicates to us that it's probably overwash deposits. But you'll also notice that there's kind of this transparent facies above that kind of looks like a heel bank. And we actually think that's reworked sand. So we're no longer getting that internal stratigraphy, and it's all been reworked. But what we can do is we can map the base of that transparent unit and try to get an idea of what this overwash deposit looks like. And so that's what I've done. And then I subtracted them, and we see that kind of close to the sandbank and right under the sandbank, we have the most material, and then it kind of thins as you go landward. And that is kind of the classic geometry of what a overwash deposit would look like. You have really thick deposits close to the barrier island, and then once you lose that energy, it kind of disperses and you get a wedge-shaped structure. And so to us, the dipping reflections plus the geometry showing the thickening near the barrier island suggests to us that this really is overwash deposits. Okay, so I mentioned, like many slides ago, that the base of healed has these two different components to it. One is erosional and one is conformable. And so right here, this, if you can see it, this lavender color is our erosional surface beneath healed bank. And then at some point it transitions to this more conformable surface that's just draping the underlying topography. So this is seaward up here, and as you go landward, you get more conformable surfaces. And so when I actually mapped that out and created my subtraction maps, the erosional surface portion is actually confined outside of the valley, whereas the conformable surface is within the valley. And we've been kind of talking about how do you get an erosional and conformable surface at the same time. And ultimately, kind of what we've settled on for now is that they're two separate environments. And so the conformable surface is likely estuarine sediments, and then the erosional surface is like the active sand sheet that formed on top of the estuarine sediments. Okay, so I know I showed you a ton of stuff, and I really don't have much to say about things that are conducive for preservation except for accommodation space. But so far, the things that I've done is, one, identified a paleo-barrier island in the record, and then also identified a sand sheet. So we see those washover deposits. We can actually track some of the tidal ravines below, and there's a very clear transgressive surface beneath healed and Sabine. So then in terms of why Sabine drowned, we looked at antecedent topography and slope. So because the banks are located partially over the Paleo Valley, we likely have a negative slope that would mean our valley or our barrier island is going to drown. We have a warm, dry climate, and the Mississippi Delta lobes are shifting east. So we have lower sediment supply, barriers can't keep up. Sea level is low, but because we have this antecedent topography that is negative and we have a lower sediment supply, we could have actually crossed some kind of sea level threshold here. And then storms are also possible. We have these preserved washover deposits, which indicate at some point there was a lot of storms during the history of Sabine. And then in terms of what conditions are conducive for preservation, you know, all of the literature says accommodation is really important, and I totally believe that. And we have a huge paleo valley that provides a lot of accommodation. But because some of these things are depositing and preserved outside of the valley, I think there has to be some other process that is important. And currently, I don't have a great idea of what that is yet, but hopefully in a couple months I'll have a better idea. Yeah, next steps, you know, the usual. Continue working on horizons, yeah, creating those better structure maps with our better algorithm. And then also we want to integrate sedimentology with seismics. So there's a lot of cores that have been taken outside of our study area, and we can actually use a correction to integrate the cores with the seismic data, put some dates on it, and actually get some idea of linking process with time. I don't think I have anything else. Well, we can go back to this. Questions?
Good. Yeah, do we have any questions in the room or online?
I have a super dumb question.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be sand to like stop the flooding? Why can't they put big rocks?
So they have before, like they typically want to put kind of natural sands on the beach for a lot of different reasons. One is, so if they put a lot of rocks on a sandy beach, they're gonna have a really big problem with tourism. People aren't gonna be super happy about going to lay on a huge rock pile. So that's one reason, but the other reason is it's really important for biology. So we have sea turtles that nest, and if you put rocks, you can't create sea turtle nests. You know, birds also like the little critters that live in the sand. So there's a lot of reasons that you shouldn't do that. Have they done it in the past? Yeah.
Did you have, I guess, because like Jake and Patty also kind of work on the same area, did you guys have like prior knowledge going in, or were you just really hoping that either Sabine or Field was gonna be a barrier island? Otherwise, the project would have gone another way.
So this is where their work is.
Mhm.
So it's not even near the banks. We knew there had to be a barrier island here at some point because there's an estuary. You have to have a barrier island to have an estuary. So we knew there used to be an estuary. We just weren't sure if the sandbanks were actually estuaries. And then, you know, BOEM funded this project really to look for sand resources. And it's going to be kind of a problem because I don't think they can use Sabine like they want to if it's a barrier island, because they really like to preserve the archaeology. And so if humans have ever, you know, walked over it, then it's an archaeological site and they might not be able to use it. But if Heald is not, they can use all that sand if they want.
That would be difficult if you're trying to find shallow sand resources to make them not anthropological.
Well, so if they're marine sand bodies, you have, nobody's walked over them, right? So, yeah,
What's the water depth?
that is a great question. $15 milliseconds, which is really times 0.75.
Okay. Like, yeah, I don't know. 100 meters? Or,
No, it's like,
oh, 1200, oh,
yeah.
Okay, so it's really deep. So why would?
No.
10 meters, okay.
It's like 9 meters.
9 meters.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, from, yeah, that's, so that's pretty shallow.
Yeah. Very shallow. But it's fine, they can't use it, so.
I have a question. So when you show the models of a barrier island drowning, it's that's sort of like this one-dimensional cross section, but is there, do you think there's lateral variation in like either the timing or the processes that might impact like when that happens, and is any of that information preserved in what you're able to see from the seismics?
Yes, I definitely think there is lateral variation. So one thing that I think is kind of cool. So when I was at UNC, I worked with Tony Rodriguez, who does all of these projects down here, and so I got to work on these a lot. And so when I first started, the barrier island was continuous, and now there are like 4 or 5 inlets that have formed within the barrier island. And so like that's gonna be lateral variation where some things are gonna survive a little bit longer than other things. But our barriers typically don't get preserved, so those incisions might get preserved. Maybe. You know, if they're deep enough to be below the storm wave base and they don't get, you know, infilled or reworked or anything like that, then they could definitely get preserved. And so we might be able to see some lateral variation within that. But just knowing what I see in the seismics, I'm not sure if it does. So when you look, I don't think I have a waveform of Sabine. But when you actually look at these different washover deposits, they're like very erosional. And so it's like you can't really follow just one horizon because they just get truncated and there's something else on top of it.
How did you decide, or whoever sent the ship out, decide which? Because there was like a kind of a gap where there was no seismics. Like
I know.
I'm sorry.
I don't know why they did that. We it's been really unfortunate. Where's my thing? So there's like one line that goes through here and there's only, I wish you could see it more, but basically you can't create any loops in this bottom portion. So like I can't check myself and like create a loop and draw a horizon and make sure that it comes back on itself, which has been really frustrating. And yeah, it was supposed to be a recon survey. We filled in a little bit of this area when we went out and did our survey, but we still don't have any data over here. So yeah, I don't know why they did that. We're planning on Afton's part. Well, that's all I've got.
Nice. Good job, yeah.
Very beautiful data visual.